Hello and welcome to Circle Time, the Early Years podcast. I'm Glenn Denny. On this edition, I'm so pleased to welcome the Director of the Institute for Science of Early Years at the University of East London. He's also the co-author alongside Dr. Gemma Goldenberg of the book Take Action on Distraction. Welcome to Circle Time, Professor Sam Wass.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
No, it's absolutely brilliant to have you here. So, Sam, tell us, what is it you're up to at the moment? What's the latest bit that you're researching?
Yeah, so we do lots of research, kind of looking at a variety of different things, Glenn. I think the thing that I'm keen to talk about today are kind of two things that in a lot of ways are the kind of yin and yang, as it were, of early childhood. So firstly, we're doing quite a lot of research looking at factors that are causing increases in stress in young children. And, I do a lot of work going around early years conferences around the country, and it's something that almost every practitioner says to me, which is, children nowadays are turning up, they're starting their kind of journey through early years in a very different state to kind of the way they were, 20 years ago. Not just in terms of kind of language and communication, but also particularly in terms of the areas that we look at, which is kind of stress and concentration, and the kind of relationship between the two. So what I was quite keen to talk about today, if it's okay, Glenn, is, firstly, just really quickly to start with some of the stuff that we think is causing the problems with that. Particularly some research that we're doing looking at early screen use and how that's affecting children's stress. But then also to spend most of the time talking about, what I think is a really good practical solution to that, which is, outdoor play, and particularly risky play, and spending as much time as you can outdoors. So both of those are very, very evidence-based as good solutions to these problems that a lot of people are finding of, behavioral dysregulation, problems in concentrating, kind of more oppositional type behaviors, and that type of thing, which we all think are all kind of come down to this kind of increase in kind of stress in children. So does that sound okay to just talk you through a bit?
Yeah, that sounds brilliant.
Yeah.
So where did this all start from? Where did this kind of research originate?
So, yeah, I mean, I think I got interested in screens initially from watching my own kids, actually. So one of the things that, you know, I've sparked my interest was, like most parents of kids, a few times when kind of desperation got the better from me. I was on a long haul flight and with my daughter when she was 18 months. And she'd been climbing all over you, the way they do, for about 5 hours, and I just couldn't deal with it anymore. So I just whipped out an iPad and put on Cocomelon. And it's amazing. They just go from the effect of screens on kids. It's just astonishing. They go from being hyperkinetic, completely incapable of sitting still, to just completely motionless, glued on the screen. And the thing that particularly interested me, Ken, was that she didn't. I was watching her thinking, do you actually have a clue what you're watching? Is she understanding anything of what you watch as an 18-month when you're watching these kind of nursery rhymes on screen? And she didn't have much language at the time, but I tried to talk about it. She couldn't tell me anything that she was watching afterwards. Even for quite a long time, she couldn't tell me anything that she was watching afterwards. But why was it then that she was just keeping her eyes so glued on the screen? This is what was fascinating me. And basically, in terms of kind of attention mechanisms, so in terms of how we pay attention, there's basically two kind of mechanisms for how we pay attention to things. One, which is an automatic mechanism, which develops very early, which is basically whenever there's movement anywhere in our visual field, we pay attention to it. Yeah. And we've developed like this because it used to be very useful for us. 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, life was pretty dangerous. There was a lot of stuff out there to eat us, and we had to chase after our food to eat it. So it's very useful for us to have that. Whenever there's something moving in my visual field, automatically a little warning signal goes off in my brain saying, pay attention to the movement that's happening. Nowadays, of course, it's not at all useful because there's very little that's dangerous or threatening in our environments, and we never have to chase after our food to go and eat it. We just have to go down to Tesco to buy it. But we still have this kind of early developing mechanism in our brain. So that, in a short, was why I think her eyes just glued on the screen. Yeah, it wasn't because she was interested or anything like that. It was because there's this very early developing mechanism that says there's movement happening, pay attention to it. And Cocomelon and all of these YouTube channels are very skilled at designing content where there's always something happening, there's always something moving. Okay, and what it wasn't, though, was the other route to paying attention, which is comes from a very different part of the brain. It comes from this bit under the forehead here, the frontal cortex, which is the slowest part of the brain to develop. And that's kind of comprehension driven attention and kind of volitional attention. So if I want to pay attention to something, then that's how kind of I focus on it. So we basically got two things that are always pushing and pulling, the environment, which is trying to pull our attention one way or the other, through things like movement, and our own kind of desire to say, no, I don't want to pay attention to that. I want to pay attention to that. Yeah. And basically in an 18-month-old, still in a 5-year-old, their ability to say that this top-down bit, the bit under the frontal cortex, is much slower to develop. So their ability to say, I don't want to pay attention to this, I want to pay attention to something else, is very rudimentary.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that got me, interested, thinking like she's just being stuck on it. She doesn't necessarily want to be looking at it. It's this kind of pay attention to movement mechanism that's keeping her attention on the thing. But the other thing that I noticed, and again, virtually every practitioner who don't tend to watch so much screens in practice, but certainly at home, will notice is that she was really irritable afterwards. Yeah. And they still are. We let them watch. They're 4 and 6 now, and we let them watch half an hour of telly yesterday morning because my wife and I had some life admin jobs to do, and they're irritable as anything. And again, everyone notices, and I was like, why? So, and the reason that we're now doing some research on this was because of this other kind of mechanism, which is basically our brains are prediction machines. Yeah. So constantly the bit under the forehead here, the frontal cortex that I just mentioned earlier, is basically as we're watching anything, or as you're listening to me talking, your brain is constantly generating this very fast predictions moment by moment for what I'm going to say next, yeah, or what you're going to see next, yeah. And basically your frontal cortex, this bit under the forehead, kind of is always guessing really, really fast, sending signals saying, I think what's going to happen next is this. And then the bottom parts of the brain are processing, saying, this is what I'm actually perceiving. And then we're looking at the relationship between the two and saying, well, I was expecting to see that and I saw that. And then that's how we learn. Yeah. So all forms of learning, but also just like seeing and acting in every day is this prediction. Yeah. So the other area that I was interested in was, so we know that kids' brains are much slower. Yeah. They've done experiments that the fastest that an adult can see is 10 frames a second, whereas the fastest that a 15-month-old can see is 1 frame a second. Yeah, so anything that's been and gone in less than a second, they can't process. And there's lots of other evidence that kids' brains are much slower. So I was interested in this. Okay, the content on this Cocomelon is happening quite fast-paced. Yeah. Because they want always to be movement happening, for reasons I just was saying earlier. But is it the case that her brain can't keep up with what is happening? Yeah, because the content is happening too fast. Yeah. And the reason that that's important is because we know from lots of other research that if stuff is happening too fast, yeah, if my environment is unpredictable, we go into this high stress mode, high alert mode. Yeah. And again, this is something that used to be useful for us. That's why we have it. Yeah. If I'm, 10,000 years ago and stuff is happening too fast, yeah, my brain can no longer predict what's going to happen next. It makes sense to go into okay, I must be in a dangerous situation. So my stress goes up. My heartbeat starts to go faster because I'm readying myself to respond to something fast and unexpected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we've got a mechanism which has been around for a very long time because it used to be useful. But now we think very possibly kids watching stuff that is too fast paced for their brains to predict what's happening next. Yeah. And that is putting them into this kind of high alert, high stress mode, which is why they're ratty as anything when they come off screens. Yeah. So that's basically some research that we're just setting up. It's very, to actually prove that idea, Glenn, it's really, really hard. We're doing a lot of kind of research, tracking their brains, to look at how their brains are tracking information in real time. And there's some really, really, really tricky neuroscience in it. That's why nobody's really tested this idea before. But we've just got some money from the Leverhulme grant to do a 3-year project, kind of looking at this. So yeah, invite me back in 3 years and I might be able to say a bit more about that. But yeah, I mean, if we can talk a bit more about that, or we can go on to, what in a lot of ways is the solution, I think, to that, or certainly one of the solutions to, kids watching a lot of early life screens, kind of getting high stress. And the solution to that is kind of outdoor play and risky play. Well, certainly one of the solutions. Or do you want to go and talk about that, or do you want to stick on this a bit longer?
We'll stick on this for a bit longer because it's quite interesting learning about, the different ways even like almost the historical ways that our brains are wired and the way they're responding in the modern world to it as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is. Yeah, the bit that I feel sorry for is just um, the people, advertisers, and people like producers of content like Coco Melon are really kind of relentlessly. I mean, advertisers. I mean, this has changed. I'm 46. This has changed since I've been going on the internet. Nowadays, all these pop-ups and all these kind of moving adverts happening. You try and read any newspaper
Yeah.
website, and there's all lots of movement happening in your peripheral visual field and stuff. Um, and that's all been done from a very, very neuroscience informed. We know how attention works, and
Hmm.
that's why moving adverts cost 20 times as much as a static advert, because everything is designed to be as hard as possible for us to ignore. And YouTube are terrifyingly good at channeling a child's attention. So you actually have, you feel like you're making the choices when you're watching YouTube, but in fact, your attention is being incredibly carefully controlled. They know where they want you to be looking next, and that type of thing. And it's all from this kind of understanding that they've invested a lot of money in, about understanding how our brains have evolved over lots of times, over a long period of time, to pay attention to particular things in our environment. So it's very much a question of just, you know, advertisers and kind of tech producers are finding out about these very deep-seated mechanisms that used to be useful and now aren't anymore, and they're exploiting them for their own kind of means. Very little we can do about it.
No, there is that bit. I mean, I've seen it on various documentary programs and things that I've watched, and they talk about even for adults, not so much for children, but for adults, when placing certain things in the supermarket, it's down to it's using the brain, it's using the eyes, where the higher value items are right in your vision there.
Yeah,
And there's a
yeah,
lot of psychology, which you wouldn't think in like your everyday life. Psychology of going to the supermarket.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
bizarre.
yeah,
So if they're doing that to adults,
yeah.
the same obviously must be happening with children then.
Yeah, and particularly, I think though the one area where I really don't think there's enough appreciation at the moment is just how differently, children's brains process things than adults, particularly how much more slow paced they are. The child's brain is this big, messy, wired jumble of over connections. Yeah, so we go through this process where all of the neurons kind of branch out and they make connections with other neurons. And the number of brain connections that we have in our brains kind of peaks somewhere between about 2 and 5. And then, it goes down after that. But because of that, children's brains process stuff, very differently. And in particular, they're much slower, and they're much more kind of inefficient in how their brains talk to one another. Um, and this idea of just, the modern world is getting faster and faster and more relentless at pulling our attention one way or another. Um, and the bit that I really feel sorry for in that is the young kids, because, just imagine just that your experience of reality was just sped up 10 times. Yeah.
Hmm.
That's what the modern world feels like for a kid. It's not they're experiencing the world at the same time, but their brains are processing stuff 10 times slower.
Yeah.
So imagine just putting a fast forward, and that's how life is happening, like all this blur that's happening in front of you. And that's what the world feels like from a child's point of view.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite scary as well that, everything's happening so quick and we're being bombarded with messages. And even like you say, when you visit even websites like YouTube or whatever, they're still flashing, adverts pop up and all that. And there's so much going on. It can stress children out, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. So that is the area where kind of it's hardest to measure kind of long-term trends. So maybe I should have said at the beginning, but I use this word stress a lot. So what we're actually measuring in terms of stress is kind of bodily stress. So you ask kind of people what is stress, and you get 50 people picking up their hands, and about 25 will say stress is me not being able to lie, sleep at night because I'm lying in bed at night worrying and thoughts are going through my head. I know I've got an officer inspection, whatever coming up, that type of thing. So what we call kind of psychological things, so thoughts and feelings. And then other half of people will say, for me, stress is a stomach ache. My palms feeling sweaty, a dry mouth. The feeling of my heart pounding inside me. And stress is both of these things. It's both something in the mind and in the body, and we know that they're very interrelated.
Yeah.
We can't obviously measure kind of psychological aspects of stress in young children. We work a lot with babies, and obviously you can't ask a baby to tell you how they're feeling,
Yeah.
but we can measure the bodily signs of stress. So what we're measuring is basically what we call the fight or flight stress system. So just as I mentioned earlier, when you're in a situation where there's stuff happening too fast, and your brain can't make predictions about what's going to happen next, you go into the fight or flight system, and it's basically, your heart starts to beat faster because your body thinks you're about to actually be fighting or flighting. You start to sweat because you're expecting to do exercise that's going to cool you down. Your mouth gets dry, because you're conserving water, because you think you're going to be doing a lot of running. You get a big release of glucose, a big kind of increase in glucose breakdown in the muscles because you're expecting to do a lot of running, that type of stuff. So that is kind of short term what we measure. And there's good evidence that screens in particular put us into this fight or flight mode, just as being outdoors is very helpful at getting us out of that quickly. We'll get onto that in a second. But what's harder to measure is the long-term aspect. So are stress levels increasing historically? Yeah, just because our stress levels go up and down during the course of the day, and it's very hard to be sure. And they differ a lot between different people. So we measure heart rate, but someone who's smaller just naturally has a higher heart rate. Anyway, there's a relationship. Hummingbirds have got really fast heartbeats. Elephants have got really slow heartbeats. And kids, it's the same for us. So the smaller we are, the faster the heartbeat. So it's very hard to be sure are stress levels going up over time. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at. But we think, certainly from rates of stress-related problems, yeah. So, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, that type of thing. We think that there's good evidence that it's likely that stress levels are going up over time. So that's what we're measuring basically.
So we're looking at kind of like we've looked at what almost the input, isn't it, which are the triggers. But what can we do to kind of, I'm not going to say solve all the stress problems because I don't think we'll ever do that. But what can we do to reduce that stress on our young children?
Yeah, so there's lots of different things that we can be doing. We do research on things like physical contact. So for most children, not all children, they find physical contact really reduces kind of stress. Talking about it, kind of co-regulation. So we do a lot of stuff on how when there's an adult kind of interacting with a child, and the child has a kind of peak in their stress, the adult kind of matches their own state. So you actually change your stress. So when my child has a kind of peak in their stress, I have an increase in my stress to match it when we're measuring it in their bodies, and how that helps people to calm down. Lots of things about kind of talking, the way that you talk about it, both in the moment and afterwards, building what we call metacognitive awareness, an understanding from the child about what state they're in. We're not born understanding what our emotions are. I still have to tell my kids regularly what they're feeling at a particular time as a way of helping them to gain self-awareness about what they're feeling. So that type of thing helps. But the one thing that I'm quite keen to talk about is some research we're doing on outdoor learning, so just spending time outdoors, and how that affects children's stress. So this is actually a project with Gemma, who you mentioned, who's co-authored this book on take action on distraction. We've got a chapter in that on outdoor learning and how it affects concentration. Gemma did her PhD on working with Newham Learning. So there's a fantastic group of about 60 primary schools quite close to us in East London. And we have, a lot of kind of child mental health problems, very high rates, some of the highest rates in the country. A lot of kind of very indoors, very urban kind of environments with a lot of socioeconomic underprivilege. That's why, we're based out there, because it's a really interesting melting pot of all these different kind of early life risk factors. And we've done a project which we're actually building on in a couple of ways that I'll tell you about in a second, about looking at, can you deliver some of the benefits of outdoor learning to inner city children working in inner city schools where you don't have so much natural space. It's all very well, if you're lucky enough to live in a rural part of the world, or rural part of the country, or anywhere, it's very easy to let them outdoors. Working in an inner city setting, it's often much more challenging. So we've
Yeah.
been looking at, the practicalities of that and the effects it has on the kids. We're also just starting up a project in Hong Kong where they really have this problem quite acutely. So a lot of kind of anxiety, parental anxiety tends to be very high
Mhm.
in Asia generally. It's much higher in Asia than other parts of the world. And this idea of being very protective towards children is very strong. And a lot of parents, it's very, very hard to persuade them. So a lot of nurseries, so they have a lot of very tall tower blocks in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
A lot of them have a nursery in them. And often the nursery's right on the top of the tower blocks, but the parents are worried about people throwing stuff from a higher tower block, so they cover the nurseries in this tarpaulin, or they have in a window. Sorry, they have a kind of room, a nursery in one of the rooms in the tower block, but they're worried about people looking in, so they cover up the screen. So we
Mhm.
have these very anxious parents who are insisting on kind of keeping their children really cocooned in this very, very tightly regulated, very, very controlled, very light-free indoor environment.
Mhm.
And they're worried about that, the Hong Kong government, because there's a lot of evidence, which I'm going to go on to tell you about, that this is a long way not the optimal environments to be sending our early childhood in. So we're just setting up a project saying, can we, how do we change parents' mind about this? It's much
Yeah.
harder in that part of the world than it is in the UK. But B, how can we get some evidence? What objective measures can we be taking to show that this is actually improving outcomes for the kids? So I think it's a really, really important thing. I mean, just one of the reasons why there's lots of different reasons why outdoor learning ought to be good for kids. One of them, which always particularly struck me, is about the gut microbiome.
Mhm.
So all of the kind of microorganisms in our gut. And they did this study with this family of genetically identical mice. So they had
Mhm.
kind of a family, and they took half of them and they randomly assigned them to just being in one kind of microorganism world. Yeah, so they were always in the same cage with the same kind of
Yeah.
things. And they took the other half of the family of mice and they always raised them in a variety of different microorganisms. So one time they were in a kind of outdoor setting, one time they were in a kind of a desert setting, one time they were in an indoor setting. And then after they died, they looked at the diversity of the kind of microorganisms in the mice's stomachs, and they found that, as you'd expect, the animals that had been raised in really diverse settings had much more variety of different
Yeah.
microorganisms in the stomach. But they also linked them to anxiety. So they found that there's a lot of evidence coming out now that, diverse gut microbiomes associate with lower anxiety outcomes.
Mhm.
So the thing that really upsets me thinking about these Hong Kong kids is just this idea that it starts from anxiety. So I've got very anxious parents who were very reluctant to let me out of the building because it's too dangerous to go outside,
Mhm.
and that means that these children are growing up with really impoverished gut microbiomes, which then means that they're going to be more anxious as adults because they don't have this diversity. And they'll do the same with their kids. So it's kind of this vicious cycle that plays out over generations.
Yeah, it's like
So
that domino effect.
yeah,
It's like one goes, then it's just going to carry on moving down, isn't it?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it's tough. Yeah, but I mean, so there's a lot of reasons, why kind of outdoor learning is beneficial. As I was saying, some of them are to do with just kind of looking at nature. Yeah. Um, some of them are to do with kind of the physical properties of how things are outdoors, and then some of
Mhm.
them are to do with these other types of things like the gut microbiomes. So maybe, I mean, maybe the first one to talk about, Glenn, is the something that we do a lot of, which was looking at kind of the acoustics of different environments.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, as I was saying earlier, children's brains find it harder to choose what they pay attention to. Yeah.
Mhm.
If you think of the average acoustic in an average early years setting, yeah, you've got kind of 20 different conversations going on at once. And what our adult brains do is this really, really, really remarkable job, which is I'm trying to pay attention to what you're saying to me in an environment where if I put my mind to it, I can tune into 20 different conversations. Yeah. These 20 different conversations are all, bouncing off the walls, getting intermingled, all these
Hmm.
different sound pressure waves are getting all intermingled, and they're making my eardrum vibrate, yeah, in a way where all of the different sound waves are all intermingled when they hit us, yeah. And our brains are doing this astonishing job of saying, okay, I'm trying to pay attention to the sound waves that are coming out from Glenn's mouth, yeah, and I'm trying not to pay attention to all these other sound waves.
Hmm.
I'm actually using my prior knowledge of language, as I was mentioning earlier, to try to guess what you're going to say next, which
Yeah.
makes it easier for my brain to tune into that if it is an expected thing. So I'm using my prior knowledge of language to tune in, but I'm selectively amplifying the sound waves that are coming from your voice, and I'm selectively dampening down all the sound waves that are coming from all these
Hmm.
other different places. Yeah. And because of that, that allows me to tune into your voice and to tune out all the distraction. Yeah. So we know for lots of reasons, A, because their frontal cortex hasn't developed yet, B, because they don't have so much prior knowledge of language, that children's brains find this type of thing very much harder than adults do. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they're much more likely to get overwhelmed in a noisy setting. Yeah. Um, and just as I was saying earlier, unpredictability, yeah, too much happening increases our stress. Yeah, noisy environments increase stress. So there's a lot of evidence that noisy environments increase stress. So
Hmm.
one of the big benefits of being outdoors, yeah, is just simply the sound doesn't bounce off the wall so
Yeah.
much. Yeah. So if my mate over there hurts their foot and screams, it doesn't bounce off the wall and come back to my ears. It does reach my ears, obviously, but it's just quieter, and you get much more of a kind of a private soundscape just because stuff's
Hmm.
going up into the air rather than bouncing off and coming back to me. Um, so that's important because it suggests that not just that we should be going outdoors to learn about forest fires and how to make a campfire and
Hmm.
outdoorsy type things. Yeah, which is what I mean. I'm a parent governor at my kids' school, and we're doing forest schools. They go and have a campfire lesson, once a term, and I'm like, no, 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 this isn't what we should be doing for outdoor learning. We should be doing all lessons outdoors, particularly things like phonics, which are built around being able to hear the
Yeah.
difference clearly between different speech sounds. And again, there's loads of evidence that noisy, reverberant acoustics, associate with worse phonic outcomes. So that's one thing that I think is really important. And for Gemma's PhD that I mentioned earlier, we did some research looking at the noisiness of outdoor learning and the relationship of stress
Hmm.
in children as well as their attention patterns. And we found exactly as you would expect that the quieter the outdoor setting was, yeah, the lower the stress and the better the attention. So they kind of was exactly as we'd been expecting. And these weren't kind of woods; these were concrete playgrounds with a couple of trees in them, in a city thing. But for that reason, it still makes a difference. Yeah? There's no ceiling; the space is bigger. Um, so that's one of the things that kind of makes a big difference.
Hmm.
I mean, the other another thing is this idea of kind of movement. Yeah. So another thing that comes from being physically in a bigger space is that we're moving kind of much more across a much larger area. Yeah. Um, and there's a couple of reasons why that's important. So firstly, just, as we all know, and again, it's very evidence-based, exercise and running kind of triggers, endorphins and other
Hmm.
good chemicals that associate with better mood.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the other thing that I think is really important is kids' stress levels. So you do this measuring, their fight or flight system and their heart rate and stuff like that. It's very uneven. Yeah. Adults, we're quite relatively stable. I personally am very ADHD, so I'm kind of more up and down in terms of my stress levels from moment to moment, than an adult who's less ADHD. But kids, if you measure their heart rate, they generally much more up and down, much more kind of unpredictable than an adult is.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's useful about being outdoors is if I have a little spike, yeah, if I'm, trying to get two blocks together and I can't get them together, some Duplo blocks to stick together or something,
Yeah.
that causes frustration in me, yeah, or anything else, someone says something to me that upsets me, or I go up and try and talk to my friend and they just turn away and ignore me as little kids do. and that upsets me, I can just run it off. Yeah. So I can just self-calibrate my own movement
Yeah.
level. Yeah. Just by, just I have a little increase in my energy levels, a little fight or flight, and then I can actually do some flight. Yeah. To let me get out of
Hmm.
that, as opposed to just being cooped up, at which point the things go around. So that's one thing that's another reason, I think, again, quite a different reason why outdoor learnings kind of help with children. Um, and then I guess, yeah, the last one pretty much is quite a different one actually, which is, and this is other ways that are very specific to being in an actual natural setting as
Yeah.
opposed to just being outdoors in an urban setting, as I've been talking about. Yeah. So one of one of the other things is that there's really good evidence that looking at pictures of natural stuff, yeah, even if it is a screen with a picture of some leaves on it, or a screen with a picture of some trees on it, yeah, as well as obviously introducing natural elements into indoor settings, yeah, there's also evidence that that reduces stress, yeah, and that's a different thing that I'm quite interested in, and we don't really know why it is that just looking at pictures of natural stuff or just having a plant in a room reduces my stress levels. There's a lot of theories about why it is.
Hmm.
It could be that some people think we have a inbuilt kind of association between kind of natural elements and relaxation. Other people think that our kind of processing systems, so the visual processing systems in our brain, have evolved over lots of periods of time to process, natural shapes. Yeah. So if you think about the shape of a plant or the shape of a tree, it doesn't have very many right angles in it. It doesn't have very many straight lines in it. Not very many natural elements have got straight lines in it. Um, and our visual processing system has just developed over a long period of time to process these kind of bent lines and these we call them a lot of fractal shapes. You've got a lot of shapes that are kind of repeating, in nature, and those are just easier for our brains to process than the types of environment that we get in a built environment, which, as I say, is much more straight lines, much more right angles, much kind of sharper kind of
Hmm.
contrast,
I
much
was
more
just
sharp.
going to say the word sharp there, isn't it?
Yeah. You get a lot of sharp lines. Um, so that's the other area that we think is potentially a very different route, yeah, to outdoor learning. So this Hong Kong project, I think there are going to be practical difficulties aside from the fact that parents can convinced that if their nursery takes their children out across the road to the park or across the other side of the road, the child might get knocked down by a car, so it's not worth it. But one of the things that they're planning to do is look at the effect of bringing in these natural elements, even things like kind of wooden play toys and that type of stuff, as well as plants and that type of thing. So kind of four very different reasons, all of them good reasons why outdoor learning reduces stress and improves concentration. Yeah. One is this gut microbiome. Yeah.
Hmm.
Another is it's easier for my brain to concentrate in because I'm not having a lot of information bouncing off the walls, which is very hard for a 2-year-old's brains to process.
Yeah.
Yeah. Three is I can move more and I can self-calibrate my stress through my movements because I'm in a bigger space. Yeah. And then four is this idea of these either learned or innate associations with nature. So that I think that's quite interesting because it's just such different reasons. They're completely different reasons, but they all combine on the same thing, which is being outdoors reduces our stress levels.
It does. I mean, you're talking away there, and I'm visualizing a previous setting that I managed, which was an outdoor nursery, and comparing it to other settings I've been in, which are your more traditional kind of, not so much in a city. I was still sort of semi-rural, but they're more indoor based, and the difference between even the noise level with the children, like you were talking about the noise level there, and I was like, I used to manage a preschool room with 36 preschoolers in. You
Yeah,
couldn't hear anything. Nobody could hear anything because the noise level, you were all
yeah,
contained. Everything was bouncing off the walls. But yeah, I had 34 children aged between 2 and 5 in an outdoor setting. And most of the time I couldn't hear anything because
yeah,
it was so quiet.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I could hear whispers in the woods somewhere, but they were all there,
yeah, yeah.
and
And it
there is that.
affects you as much as the kids, but it affects the kids much, much more than it affects you.
Hmm. like you say, we're adapted. We can kind of break down. If I need to concentrate on what one of my colleagues is saying, I can do that. But you're talking to a child and their head's going left, right, up, down,
Yeah.
all around because there's too many other noises going on. And like, why would I talk to you? Because I can't hear what you're saying anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. We've just got this other project with the um, Nuffield Foundation looking at the effects on language outcomes and that apart from we've been focusing mainly on the stress and the lifelong mental health outcomes, but another thing is just the effect of the language. I think it's really it's really a big deal that makes a lot of difference to a lot of kids. The other thing that I think is interesting, and we haven't got time to talk about this in a lot of detail now. I had to maybe we could talk
I'll
about
have
it
to get you back for the
some other
next
time. Yeah,
season.
exactly. Yeah, not to invite myself back then, but is what how kind of we do a lot of work looking at how different types of kind of setting that the average type of London kid compared to the average type of kid growing up in
Mm,
kind of other types of settings. So not just are they indoors or outdoors, but even if you take groups from different parts of the country and put them in an identical indoor setting, how they behave differently. So that's about the long-term effects of the built environment. And certainly London kids, so we do a lot of babies. So the mum or the dad brings the baby in, and then they'll unwrap the baby from the pram and then put them on the floor. And the minute their bum hits the floor, they're off
yeah.
crawling somewhere, going off to explore something. And you go to other parts of the country, or I'll do some work in Finland, and quite a small town in Finland, and you're there and they're about to do testing, and the parent just unwraps the baby, and they put the baby on the floor, and the baby just sits there looking around the room for about 3 minutes, yeah. And then after about 3 minutes, they'll just really slowly go over and do that. And just that how high paced you are and how high paced your experience of the world is, that varies a lot between kids growing up in different settings. And that's another part of it, as well as how you then correct for it, which is by putting them outdoors. Yeah.
Well, we're definitely going to have to get you back, but unfortunately, time is up for this one. But yeah, we'll definitely have to get you back and talk a bit more about this because it is a fascinating project, I think, and there's still more to come. But no, for now, thank you so much for being part of it, talking to us about how the brain and the outdoors kind of link and the stress levels with children. But it's been absolutely fascinating.
Oh, good. Well, thanks for having me, Ben. I really enjoyed it.
No, brilliant. Professor Sam Wast, thank you very much.